Dawn climbs the limestone like a slow fire. Below, water cold as iron glides through a canyon so tight the wind must squeeze to pass. This is a river that smiles with clear pools and then pulls the ground out from under your boots. A river that hides its drop-offs behind reeds and its teeth under foam. Men would come to call it the Devil's River, and perhaps that is fair. If the frontier ever had a cathedral, this was its nave, arched in stone, echoing with hooves indifferent to prayer. Into this world rides a wiry Tennessean with steady eyes and a quiet mouth. A man who measures risk the way surveyors measure distance, calmly, precisely, with a pencil stub behind the ear. John Coffey Hayes was born in 1817 at Little Cedar Lick, Wilson County. He was barely 19 when Texas pulled him in like a tide. The Republic needed men who could ride hard, read country, and not rattle when the brush whispered. Hayes became all three, first as a surveyor in the Bexar district, and then as one of those citizen soldiers the frontier minted out of hunger, fear, and iron will, the Texas Rangers. The Ranger companies of the early 1840s weren't parade ground soldiers. They were sleep-starved riders who knew the smell of a hot bit in a dying fire, men who found sign in a scuffed pebble and trouble in a silence too long. President Sam Houston saw something hard and economical in them, mobile defense at a bargain price, and sent them to meet war parties, chase raiders, and show the flag where formal armies couldn't reach in time. Hayes rose among them because he understood the land and the people who lived by it, not just the angles in a surveyor's book. He listened to scouts who knew more than maps could tell. Chief among them was the Lipan Apache, known as Flacco, tall, erect, all bounding elasticity, as Hayes would later say. Flacco's people had their own blood debts and their own fragile treaties. In a season when alliances frayed like rawhide, the Lipan leaders chose, again and again, to ride beside the Rangers against Comanche war parties and Mexican incursions. They read the country with a fluency settlers struggled to learn, and Hayes listened closely. If the frontier is a ledger, the Lipan entries were written in a hand the Rangers needed to decipher or die trying. What did Hayes bring to that ledger? A mind that ran at a gallop and a disposition that stayed level when the air filled with arrows. He made his men travel light and move fast. He kept them close enough in a fight to hear one another breathe. He taught them to use the country like a weapon. Let a ridge be your shield, a draw be your trap, a river bend be the hammer that swings your line. He didn't waste words and he didn't waste chances. One story, told and retold on the granite of the hill country, captures that plain courage. In 1841, cut off while surveying, Hayes fought from the flanks of Enchanted Rock, trading shots for hours, refusing to be smoked out or rushed. The Rock's legends predate him by centuries, but Texans set his name among them. The hill stays, the story sticks, and the point is simple. Hayes did not fold. Whether the details have grown in the telling hardly matters to the men who wrote after him. A reputation has weight, and this one could steady a trigger finger or put an extra mile under a horse. Listen long enough to old Rangers talk and you'll hear how he handled fear. Not by ignoring it, only fools do that, but by sorting it like a field kit. The fear you can ride through, the fear you can flank, and the fear that means turn back now or be buried where you sit. In camp, Hayes was unassuming. In the saddle, he was inexorable. His men learned to read his shoulders the way they read weather. If the captain leaned forward a fraction, a storm was coming, and they were the thunder. The frontier had a grammar of its own, and Hayes wrote clean sentences in it. Raiders out of the Llano Estacado moved like summer storms, sudden, hard, dissolving just as suddenly into miles of brush and stone. Settlements near San Antonio bled horses, cattle, and sometimes kin. Hayes's companies hit back with speed instead of mass. From 1840 on, their skirmishes stacked up. Plum Creek, Noose's Canyon, and lesser-known fights whose names wore off like boot heels, but whose lessons held, close and fast, beats distant and brave. Surprise is a weapon, and the horse under you is half your life. He had another half-formed idea in his pocket, a tool that would let riders fight at a dead run without pausing to reload. The Texans had tinkered with Samuel Colt's 5-shot Patterson revolvers, early purchases made on faith and hunger. The guns weren't flawless, but they answered a problem as old as the first lance charge. After one shot, a long gun is a club. With a revolver, a man could keep firing. Short distances, yes, but at the ranges where fights actually ended. The Rangers began carrying them more and more, experimenting with spare cylinders preloaded in camp, trading weight for seconds in the dust. Hayes saw what this meant before most. He didn't need to write a treatise. He needed a chance to prove it. That chance came sooner than anyone expected. Along a rocky watercourse north of San Antonio, with oaks low and thick, with shadows that hid a line of riders in plain sight, the enemy began to swirl behind the Ranger column, probing, pressing, waiting for someone nervous to look back. Hayes read the pressure like a banker reads a ledger in bad times. He swung his small command hard around the base of a hill, climbed for a better angle, and bored straight into the flank that had been so careful to stay invisible. It was the old math: surprise divided by speed, multiplied by nerve. And for once, the Texans carried more numbers than their foes. But that is a story for the next stretch of trail. For now, fix the picture. A captain who studies the land until it talks to him, a company who trusts his silences, a set of 5 chambers not yet proven in the worst kind of test. In a few days, the press in Houston will call what happens unparalleled for the gallantry displayed on both sides, and Colt will hear the echo all the way to the factories back east. In a few years, an even stranger country of stone and water will take a new name from Hayes's offhand verdict: San Pedro, St. Peter. Not from this view. If goodness had a river here, it would not hide its drop-offs like snares. Devil's River fits better in a mouth taste-tested by dust and danger. Before we reach that river, there is one more face to remember in this first light. Flacco, the Lipan chief who rides where the sign grows faintest and the risk grows loudest. He is not a ranger, not a citizen of the republic these settlers have declared, and not a figure cut from any easy legend. He is an ally because the future forced a decision on him, and because Hayes listened when many would not. History remembers the captain's name. The trails themselves remember the scouts. On mornings like this, with the rocks still cool and the river quiet, you could believe the land holds both names in equal measure. The sun clears the rim of the canyon. Horses stamp and steam. Somewhere out ahead lies a creek bed with too many stories stacked in its stones, and a test that will teach the frontier a new tempo. Not the long drumbeat of muskets, but the fast, close thunder of a 5-shot pistol in the hands of riders who think at a gallop. The Rangers are already moving. Hayes gives the smallest nod, and the column flows forward like water seeking a fall. The land does not grant easy favors. It offers chances, tight, costly, and perishable. Hayes has made a habit of finding them before they evaporate. If he is lightning, as his men sometimes joke in camp, it is not the lightning that splits oaks for spectacle. It is the kind that travels cloud to cloud, unseen until it lights the whole horizon in a white thought. Walker's Creek waits just beyond that thought, and beyond the creek, a canyon with a new name. For now, the only sound is leather and breath, and the hush of a captain who measures distance in seconds rather than miles. The noon air was sweet with sap. Axes had just bitten into a bee tree when the rear guard stiffened, eyes tracking a ripple in the brush that didn't belong to wind. Alexander Coleman had the watch, and what he saw wasn't a shadow. It was a test. Figures ghosting the trail, probing the old lure that begs a green commander to spin and charge into a blind. Hayes didn't take bait. He pulled his men back into their saddles, kept them moving through timber that ran along a stony watercourse he called Walker's Creek, and let the pursuers keep thinking the Rangers were the ones being led. June 8, 1844, 15 men, light on rations, heavy on nerve. When the decoys realized their trick had failed, they threw off the mask. A line opened like a stage curtain. Scores of mounted warriors, the main body, not the pickets, arrayed across scrubby live oaks and blackjack, with a stony hill behind them like a waiting shield. Hayes glanced at the ground and made a decision faster than most men could articulate the choices. He read the hill's throat, the cover, the short runs between brush clumps, and the way the slope could hide a column until it was almost at level ground. Then at the foot of that hill where the terrain swallowed them from sight, the captain wheeled his little band and lanced them forward at full speed, 200 or 300 yards around the base, up the flank to appear where a defender least expects a storm, from the side instead of the teeth. The Rangers came in on the high ground at a full charge. The hilltop went to knives, fists, and muzzle flash. Benjamin McCulloch would later say it was rough and tumble, and the phrase is honest. This was not a painting, it was bone and breath. Twice the enemy lunged for the Ranger flanks. Twice they were shoved off the crest and back into the brush. Here is where the music changed. In fights like this, a single-shot rifle is a one-note instrument. You play it once, and then you're mute while someone closes the distance with a lance. But the Rangers had been drilling with something new, Colt's 5-shot Patterson revolver. At Walker's Creek, it was not a gentleman's novelty. It was a rider's solution. Where a long gun coughed and fell silent, the pistols kept barking, short and vicious, the rhythm of a fight at arm's length. The effect was not myth. It was arithmetic. Men who had always counted on that pause between shots found no pause at all. When the enemy broke from the hill, the Rangers spurred hard and pursued, firing from the saddle, pressing them for miles over stone and thorn. The air filled with dust and powder grit. Even with repeaters, the fight chewed through ammunition. Some Rangers halted in the chase to reload, stripping caps and powder, counting the last rounds left in a rifle or pistol as the distance thinned and thickened again. A few models of the early Pattersons lacked loading levers, and field reloads could be clumsy. Some accounts speak of men swapping in preloaded cylinders, others of three-piece disassembly that made recharging a procedure rather than a reflex. However they managed it in the scrub that day, the simple truth remains. Reloading on a hot trail was awkward, and every round you could keep ready before the charge counted for more than its weight in lead. Near the end of that running fight, Hayes saw the calculus pivot on one man and issued an order as cold as arithmetic. Dismount and shoot the chief. Robert A. Gillespie, already carrying a lance wound that would have hobbled a lesser rider, dropped from the saddle, steadied, and fired. When their leader fell, the rest scattered into brush so thick it might as well have been night. The Rangers held the field. They camped astride the old Pinta Trail and sent Joshua Threadgill back to San Antonio to pull a relief column. By morning, McCulloch had riders on the way. In the tally that followed, Hayes reported 1 Ranger killed, Peter Four, a German, 4 wounded, and among the enemy, Mexicans and Indians, 23 dead and 30 wounded. Samuel Walker, his body punctured by a lance, was expected to die. He did not then. The hill took its price and let him ride on. Newspapers reached for language big enough to fit what had happened. The Houston Morning Star called it unparalleled for the gallantry displayed on both sides. But it was more than gallantry. It was a change in how a small force survives a larger one. The Rangers had used terrain like a tool, speed like a blade, and new weapons as a force multiplier. In a report that reads today, like the birth certificate of modern mounted gunfighting, Hayes closed the book on one detail with a verdict that rang back east and forward in time. I cannot recommend these arms too highly. That sentence traveled. 2 years later, another Ranger captain, Samuel Hamilton Walker, would correspond with Samuel Colt to shape a revolver fit for war. Heavier, harder hitting, a horseman's fist wrapped in steel. The result, the Walker Colt of 1847, became the first revolver adopted by the U.S. Army, its cylinder roller engraved by Waterman Ormsby with a scene from Walker's Creek, as if to admit that a particular hill of scrub and stone had altered the national conversation about weapons and the way men would fight from the saddle. The Ranger pistols at Walker's Creek had been fragile in places and fussy to reload. The Walker Colt was an answer hammered into metal. In our century, Texas would honor that lineage by declaring the Walker Colt the state's official handgun, a nod across time to an afternoon when a 5-shot rhythm rewrote tactics. It's tempting to tell this story as a clean triumph, to smooth the edges and set it on a shelf labeled progress. The men on both sides would spit at that. They fought up close where you can see pupils change and hear a lung work. The Rangers' advantage was real, steel and powder arranged in a new geometry. But victory still leaned on what Hayes had drilled into them. Stay together in the rush, keep your horses between death and daylight, strike where the ground gives you a hand, and do not tarry where it takes one away. The revolver didn't replace judgment, it rewarded it. What did it look like in the last minutes, as the chase lengthened into exhaustion? Think of riders bent low, bodies telegraphing pain in tiny flinches they could not afford to admit. Think of dust laying a second skin on every face. Think of the terrible quiet after, the sound of a creek moving the same as it did at noon, indifferent, as if it had not just watched men grind one another to pieces on its banks. The Rangers cleaned their weapons with hands that trembled. A few stacked spent caps in little pyramids and smiled at nothing. Hayes walked the line like a man counting breaths, and perhaps he was. Leadership after a fight is not speeches. It is simple presence in the careful distribution of water. Set the scene against the larger map, and you watch ripples spread. In Central Texas, raiding parties would still come. The land never ran out of hard lessons, but something fundamental had shifted. The old Comanche tactic of drawing fire, collapsing the distance and finishing with arrow or lance had met a response that did not pause when it should have. The report would ride by courier to desks that hadn't smelled mesquite smoke in years, and from those desks to factories where ideas hardened into parts. The frontier did not become safe, it became different. In the ranger tents that night, someone would have joked to ease the weight, and someone else would have laughed too loudly. Walker lay among the wounded men and stared at canvas seams, trying to decide whether the line that marked his life would continue tomorrow. Gillespie slept badly, the order and the shot replaying across a brain that understood orders and shots better than dreams. Hayes wrote his report without embellishment, the way a surveyor writes distance, and handed it to the next rider out. Years later, collectors would turn a Walker Colt in the hand and run a finger over Ormsby's cylinder engraving, as if touch could bridge time to a hill near a creek where a captain made an impossible angle possible, where 5 shots could be a sentence instead of a syllable, and where the future nudged the present and said, try it this way. But before the museums and the language and the state honors, there was only a handful of men who dared a flank where common sense warned against it. A brief, punishing proof that to think fast at a gallop is the rarest virtue on earth, and a weapon that, flawed and finicky as it was, let that virtue speak in a new grammar. On Walker's Creek, the frontier learned how it would be argued from now on. At close range, without time to philosophize and with an iron insistence that the first man to keep shooting gets to write the paragraphs afterward. By morning, the relief column found them, tired, hollow-eyed, but intact, the smoke of the previous day hanging over the brush like a second dawn. The creek said nothing. The men saddled, shifted weight on sore ribs, and rode out. In a couple of years, a different river would take a new name from Hayes' lip, and the country would add a fresh test to the Ranger ledger. For now, the hill behind them kept its story, and the road ahead, always the road ahead, asked its next hard question. War changes the gait of a country. In the spring of 1846, Texas dust turned into army columns, and a Ranger captain who'd learned to think at a gallop put on a new title, Colonel John Coffee Hayes, mustering a regiment of mounted rifle volunteers into federal service. The 1st Regiment of Texas Mounted Rifle Volunteers carried the Ranger habit of moving light and striking fast into the United States Army of Occupation under Zachary Taylor. They were scouts, screens, and shock, work done in the uneasy space between maps and gun smoke, where a wrong guess could cost a supply train and a month. By September, the war had pulled them to the stone streets of Monterey, a city cupped by mountains and welded with walls. The dates are etched into every narrative of Taylor's Northern Campaign, September 21st to 24, 1846, 4 days that taught Americans what it means to fight house to house. Here the Rangers were not the whole blade, but they were the point, probing flanks, sifting alleys, and forcing contact where the regulars could not see beyond a barricade. The city's architecture, thick doors, barred windows, flat roofs rimmed with parapets, turned each block into its own fort, and each street into a funnel that could swallow a regiment. Taylor divided his strike, one column to the east, another, under General William J. Worth, to the west where the high ground, Independence, Federation Hill, and the Bishop's Palace, commanded the city. That western climb was the kind of work Rangers understood. Find the ground that decides a battle, then get there first. 7 companies under Hayes and his lieutenants pushed with Worth's men, steep switchbacks under fire, the skyline edged with gun barrels. When the heights finally broke, the view snapped into a new geometry of advantage. Cannon rolled forward, and the city's defenders felt the uphill fight turn into a downhill problem. Street fighting on the next day pressed a different lesson. Rushing intersections fed men into crossfires. Blasting at facades bled ammunition without effect. Worth listened to seasoned Texans, men who had fought in streets before, and changed the rhythm. Don't race the avenues, they told him. Cut through the walls. The troops began mouse-holing, punching through adobe from house to house, using roofs like covered walkways, turning the city's strength, its connected masonry, into their own covered lanes. Cannon were hauled up to blast entry gaps. Squads poured through the smoke to grapple room by room until doorways and rooftops stopped killing them for their courage. By the 23rd, the tactics were working. The butcher's bill bent downward because the army finally fought the city as it was built. Hayes' Rangers threaded that maze as outriders for the regulars, testing corners, flushing ambushes, chasing the rumor of a gap with the speed of men more comfortable in brush than boulevards. They were not in uniforms that would charm a painter, but they did the work a formal army only learns under duress. By night, the streets stank of powder and lathered horses. By morning, the columns crept forward again, the mountains peering down like judges. When the capitulation came, an armistice that let Mexican forces withdraw in order, the Americans called it a victory and the Mexicans called it a bitter pause. But no one who had crossed those streets unscathed was in the mood to argue semantics. The ledger said the city had been taken. A name followed the Rangers out of Monterrey like a shadow. Civilians and soldiers south of the river began to speak of Los Diablos Tejanos, the Texas Devils, riders with a talent for sudden arrival and a tolerance for dirty work that soldiers in tidy lines find hard to love and harder to live without. The nickname was both fear and respect, a field promotion in the language of enemies. It stuck to the regiment and to the Ranger myth Hayes had been writing since the Hill Country, now printed in a new font by urban war. Contemporaries tallied the win in neat columns. The heights stormed, barricades pierced, the plaza approached, the armistice signed. But the real accounting lived in smaller lines. A corporal learning to swing a pick at a wall under fire without thinking about his hands. A ranger showing a regular how to hug a parapet's lip to keep his hat from drawing a bullet. An artillery sergeant discovering the precise yardage where a street gun can chew a doorway without throwing masonry into his own ranks. The city itself graded the homework. Every mistake earned red ink in blood. The Rangers, used to ambush country, treated street corners like cedar mottes. Never enter from the front, always feel for a side that doesn't announce you. The advice read as common sense when spoken. The trick was having someone to speak it in time. Hayes carried the same habits that had served him on the frontier. He kept his reports spare. He moved his men as if distance were a tax you paid with casualties. He let the ground teach him, even when the ground was paved. Where a regular officer saw a block of buildings, Hayes saw angles, roof lines, lines of sight, how stone funnels a bullet, and where a rider can become a shadow with 2 steps and a breath. In a war that soon sprawled toward Buena Vista, and then the Mexico City campaign, Monterrey stood like a hard school that the Army had to pass through before the rest of the syllabus made any sense. There were laurels to share, and controversies that would hang in the air. Rangers were admired for audacity and cursed for excess in equal measure. Reputations are messy when sharpened in alleys. What endures in the steadier accounts is the utility they brought when the fight refused to behave like a field manual. The way mounted scouts turned into tutors for an urban assault, translating lessons learned in San Antonio and Mir into the grammar of a different city. Hayes did not invent this harsh literacy, but he carried it without flinching, and his men learned to write it fast. By October, the regiment's first term of service was ending as fast as it had begun. Volunteers go home, armies shift their weight, generals trade ground for time. Hayes's riders had left a very specific signature on Taylor's campaign, a proof that speed, nerve, and local cunning could bend a city just enough for a line of blue coats to get through. The moniker Texas Devils would trail him west into later chapters and coil back through Texas memory each time someone asked how a handful of horsemen could change the arithmetic of a larger war. On the ledger's margin, in cramped script, the city wrote its own verdict. The Rangers were not the whole story, but the story ran faster with them in it. The trail west breathed heat even at dawn, the kind that bakes judgment into a man's bones. Hayes had ridden desert edges before, brush country north of the Rio Grande, chalky hills that thirst all the way down. But this was different. The country ahead was broken as a bottle, cleaved by a clear, cold artery that flashes blue through stone and then vanishes behind knife ridges as if ashamed of its generosity. Travelers had called it San Pedro. Earlier Spaniards, skirting its reaches in 1590, wrote it down as laxus, feeble, a poor joke on a stream that sometimes keeps its dangers under glass. Hayes stood over one of its canyons, asked the name, and, hearing St. Peter invoked, answered the land in the only language it understood. Devil's River, he said, and the name stuck. If the frontier had sacred texts, they'd be written in water and limestone. Here the channel is a rumor until it isn't, then a sudden drop that eats men and mules whole if you take your eyes off the white lip of the current. The river runs 94 miles from the headwaters in Sutton County to its mouth on the Amistad country, taking 32 tributaries along the way, Dolan Creek and Dark Canyon among them, each a thread that can tangle a traveler in slick ledges, cattail blind turns, and chutes that sound like a low growl until they're on you. It drinks light. It drinks time. Hayes read it carefully because he planned to ride with it as far as it would guide him, then break off toward El Paso when the country finally offered a passage that wouldn't get his men killed quicker than a wrong answer at a knife fight. A road to El Paso was the prize in 1848, a wagon line you could bet commerce and mail on, not a string of grave markers. Citizens in San Antonio had pushed for it. The Army would send its own survey party soon enough. Hayes went first in that season, a pathfinder's errand that would be followed the next year by Lieutenants Whiting and Smith of the Corps of Engineers, and by Major Robert Neighbors with his own column. Whatever trail the captain found would be tested and argued over, improved, rerouted, and judged by time. But someone had to sketch the first draft with hoof prints. He never rode alone. If the Walker's Creek lesson was that a revolver could change the tempo of a fight, the Devil's River lesson was that humility could lengthen your life. Hayes listened to Lipan Apache allies who could read a pebble as if it held yesterday's story, and to Delaware scouts whose patience with sign and springs turned days from gambles into plans. In the oldest accounts and the memories of men who kept diaries with dust in them, you see their work everywhere on this stretch, choosing a crossing where the bedrock shelves hold, sensing the kind of cloud that raises a wall of water in a side canyon, finding a camp where the night wind won't steal the saddle blanket off your mount. Rangers wrote the reports. The scouts wrote the miles. What keeps the river cold and glassy is a machine no man built. Underground, the Edwards Trinity Aquifer moves through fractured limestone, water stored and pushed by a geology that leaks in useful ways, karst riddled with joints and caves that discharge as springs along the canyon walls. That's why the water stays clear even when the country all around is baked to tinder. The river is fed from beneath by a stone cistern older than any argument about names. Hayes didn't need the vocabulary. He had the evidence under his horse. Pools as green as bottles, riffles that sang against the rock, sudden boils where invisible mouths in the cliff let go of a week's worth of underground wandering. He marked his crossings and kept moving. Dolan Creek joined from the west, and the land raised its voice at a lip of rock the color of old bone. When the springs run strong, Dolan Falls thunders. When drought pinches, it shrinks to a slick rock hazard that swallows the unwary. Years later, men would attach a ranger's name, Pat Dolan, to the place, in a fight to the year 1873 because the frontier likes to stitch memory to stone. For Hayes in 1848, the falls were a teacher. This is where speed will leave you broken. This is where you shoulder kit and lead the horses, or find another line that promises fewer ways to drown in clear water. The land here doesn't merely resist, it conspires. Chaparral and mesquite rake your flanks. Limestone shelves offer false floors. A canyon will run straight until it doesn't, and the first man around a bend has a coin flip's chance of being a dead man. That is why the old travelers hugged the devil's north-south thread as long as they could, water and guidance braided together, before turning east or west into the stone seas. Hayes kept the same rule. You stay with the current until it stops helping. Then you slip away between ridges, quick and quiet, while the country is still deciding if it will punish you for your nerve. By night, the column moved like a single animal. Canteens checked by touch, hooves muffled where the gravel told on them, every man counting the hours to the next spring. Hayes had a knack for two kinds of distance, the kind on a map and the kind measured in an animal's breath. You don't push a mount into a dry night if the next water's only a rumor. You don't camp in a storm throat where a midnight rise can pack gear and men into the angle of a rock before you can curse. The captain's talent was not just courage, it was an instinct for what a river gives and how quickly it takes it back. In time, the line he drew, riding, doubling back, riding again, would feed the set of choices other parties made. Whiting and Smith would measure with engineers' eyes. Neighbors would test crossings with freighters' caution. The road would come, not as a single grand stroke, but as a negotiation with every arroyo, every bluff that says no. And then, after an hour, grudgingly says maybe. On maps, a route looks inevitable. On the ground, it's a string of small mercies you gather and hope will hold. To understand the Devil's River, you have to hold two thoughts that hate each other. First, it is among the most intact pieces of running water left in Texas, a ribbon of clarity that conservation groups and private landowners have guarded like a secret too good for careless mouths. Second, it is unforgiving. Carelessness costs full price. Modern paddlers learn both truths at once. Permits are limited, access is rationed, and the land enforces its own terms regardless of how much ink the regulations spill. You hear echoes of Hayes in those rules, not in language, but in the idea that respect is a survival tool. Stand above one of the river's glassy bends at evening, and you begin to understand why the name Hayes gave, or at least fixed in the public mouth, stuck. The place pretends to be harmless when the light is kind, then shows you the seam where black water drops away and the canyon narrows like a vice. A saint would bless such a corridor. A surveyor who has had to pull men out of a bad choice calls it what it feels like. And yet the same bends lay out a kind of mercy. In summer, the wind slides cool off the current. In drought, the pools hold life that the uplands cannot. The Devil's River is less a villain than a judge. It weighs you without speaking. By the time Hayes angled away from the watercourse toward the long reach west, he had a ledger's worth of facts and a head full of cautions you can't write down. A river can be a road if you move with it. A canyon can be a trap if you mistake sound for sense. A name once spoken with conviction can harden into a map note faster than any committee's vote. The men who followed, soldiers, teamsters, emigrants with their lives in wagons, would thank and curse him by turns, as all travelers do the first person who told them a truth they had to pay to believe. That is the work of a pathfinder, to outpace your own myth long enough to draw a usable line. And on this hard stream, the line Hayes drew was less about chiseled roots than about a way of thinking. Strike fast when stone gives you a flank. Go soft when water says be small. Never confuse a clear surface with a safe passage. If lightning can learn anything from water, perhaps it is this. Speed only matters when you know where to set it down. On the Devil's River, Hayes learned when to be thunder and when to be hush. The country kept both lessons, and sometimes, if the wind is right, you can hear them arguing across the canyon long after the hoof prints have sifted back into dust. A story leaves tracks the way a wagon leaves ruts. Some are shallow, soon erased by rain. Others bite so deep they become the road itself. What Hayes did in Texas, his speed, his preference for flanks over fronts, his habit of letting terrain and water do half the work, didn't end with a handful of fights or a single hard river. It hardened into routes and routines, into the way travelers crossed a punishing quarter of the continent, and into the ways Texans remember the borderlands. Precise about danger, stingy about luck, reverent before water. The year after war's drums quieted, a problem rose like heat from the west. How do you thread a dependable line from San Antonio to El Paso? Something more than a brave man's guess, something a mail coach and a freight train of mules can trust. San Antonio merchants hired Hayes in 1848 to try the first draft of that answer. He pushed west for 3.5 months, reading country with a surveyor's caution and a ranger's appetite, following rivers where they ran and skirting them where they trapped, before hunger, thirst, and distance turned the expedition back near Presidio. The line wasn't complete, but the question had been shaped. Others could pick it up. The Army's topographical eyes arrived the next season. Brevet Major General William J. Worth sent 2 young engineers, William H. C. Whiting and William F. Smith, to take the Hayes trace and finish it. They did what good engineers do, confirmed where the earlier path made sense, abandoned what didn't, and on the return stitched a practical wagon road out of the country's reluctant seams, down the Rio Grande, east to the Pecos, then along the Pecos to the Devil's River, before angling back toward San Antonio. Whiting's report was spare and professional. This route could serve military and commercial travel. In the language of soldiers and merchants, that means lives saved and freight delivered. A parallel attempt came from Major Robert S. Neighbors, frontier Indian agent, tireless rider, who steered an upper road in 1849, crossing the Pecos at Horsehead, running by Hueco tanks and the Guadalupe Mountains before dropping into El Paso. He and his men returned in May and June with the same judgment. The trail can be made to carry wagons. Between the Whiting-Smith route and the Neighbors route, the West opened a fraction, enough to let stagecoaches, supply trains, and fevered 49ers move under a plan instead of a prayer. In time, mails would roll, San Antonio-El Paso mail after 1851, and for a crucial stretch, the Butterfield Overland in the last years before the Civil War. Each schedule line another groove cut into the stone. Unromantic? Only if you've never depended on a road. A line scouted by rangers and scouts became an artery for the Army's bread and bullets, for a merchant's flour and a mother's letter, for the small commerce that holds a far country in reach of the rest of the nation. If you ask the old maps, they'll tell you that a lower emigrant road ran the length of West Texas, and an upper road skirted north of the Edwards Plateau, meeting near Comanche Springs on its long drag to the Rio Grande. The words are dry, the distances are not. What of the river that taught Hayes when to strike and when to slip away? The Devil's kept its name, though even now historians politely disagree whether Hayes coined it in 1848 or merely helped fix a label already whispered by travelers. The older Spanish name, San Pedro, lingered for generations. The explorer Castaño de Sosa wrote Laxus, slack, back in 1590. But the story that Hayes peered into a dark gorge and snorted that St. Peter did not fit has endured, partly because it sounds like him, and partly because anyone who has watched the river's smooth lip drop into a roar understands why piety would step aside for precision. Either way, TSHA puts Hayes at the naming center, and Texas Highways records the quip and the later line from his report. The party named it for the difficulties we had in extricating ourselves from the deep ravines and mountains which encompass it. The place confirmed the word, then kept it. Modern boots still test that clarity. The Devil's River remains a rare thing in Texas, clean, spring-fed, and as close to wild as a map will let you approach. Conservationists and private landowners have guarded large pieces of the watershed. The Nature Conservancy holds Dolan Falls Preserve and has helped secure protections across well over 100,000 acres in the basin. Permits limit traffic. The state, through its Devil's River State Natural Area, rations access and enforces distance between groups. An institutional version of the old frontier wisdom that some corridors will tolerate only a few travelers at a time. Even the price of a permit, $10 at last printing, reads like a curated courtesy in a place that otherwise charges in bruises and swimbacks. All of which is a long way to say, the river didn't change, we changed around it. The same limestone shelves lie in wait below glass water. The same sudden chutes announce themselves late and without apology. The same country that dragged at Hayes' stirrups still insists that respect is a survival tool. You can hear the harmonies across time, ranger lightning paired with river judgment, each correcting the other's excess. On the Devil's, speed without humility is a fast mistake. Humility without speed is a lingering one. Hayes himself carried the habit of roads west. In 1849, he joined the California Rush, leading a party across a country that ate men 3 meals a day if they let it. A year later, San Franciscans elected him sheriff. A ranger's eye turned to urban trouble, and by 1853 he was Surveyor General of California, a peacetime office for a man who had spent a long youth at war. It suits the arc. Surveyor turned captain turned surveyor again. A life spent measuring where people belong on land that resists belonging. He made money, raised a family, and kept a hand in politics. Neutral in the war that split his first country, pragmatic in the state that became his last. The grave lies in Oakland. The county name for him lies back in Texas. Between them runs the simple fact that a frontier's best students do not stop learning when the gun smoke clears. What, then, is the memory that clings to the Devil's River and the roads that radiated from it? Some remember the Ranger's nerve and the revolver's tempo, the way a close fight could turn when 5 shots replaced 1. Others remember the scouts beside them, the Lipan who read the ground like scripture, the Delaware whose patience made a road where a rumor had been. Official histories carry both, though not always in equal measure. The land keeps better accounts. It remembers everyone who bled on it and everyone who learned. And it gives the last word to water that still runs clear over pale stone, to a canyon that still says be careful without raising its voice. A different kind of ledger closed the matter on paper. Reports and maps, Whiting's, Smith's, Neighbors's, became the scaffolding for routes that mail coaches and freighters turned from lines into lifelines. The San Antonio-El Paso road carried letters and payrolls in the detritus of a restless nation. For a brief, crucial run, the Butterfield's coaches bounced that same stone. In the administrative prose of the young republic in the newer state, you can hear the echo of Hayes in the river. Find the ground that will carry weight. Give the rest back to the desert. Stand on a bluff above the devils at last light and the ledgers get quiet. The water is cold and persuaded, a flow older than the hard choices we wrote beside it. A nighthawk cuts the sky to stitches, a kingfisher needles the pools. Somewhere upstream a paddler pores over a map and a weather report, and somewhere far downstream a mail coach that no longer runs still rattles in a museum case. Between them is the same old instruction Seth Hayes learned here. Move fast when you must, invisible when you can, and never pretend a clear surface means a safe passage. Roads, maps, memory, each is only as honest as the people who draw them. On the Devil's River, honesty begins with the admission that we follow more than we lead. Victories have a way of simplifying themselves in memory. The ledger sums to a tidy number. The map collapses into a single, confident line. But the frontier never agreed to that neatness, and neither did the people who paid for Hayes' lessons with their lives. If Walker's Creek announced a new rhythm of war and the Devil's River taught the patience that keeps men breathing, the years around those moments insisted on a harder truth. Every advantage carves a shadow. Start with the ally who rode closest to the captain's quiet. Flacco, tall, whip-lean, Lipan Apache, read the ground like a language, and he read Hayes much the same. Between them grew a compact as practical as it was personal. The Lipan had reasons enough to take the Ranger Trail. Old enmities with Comanche raiders, fragile agreements with Tejanos who had become neighbors, a calculus of survival in a world suddenly thick with settlers. The Rangers, for their part, needed eyes that could find a safe ford by scent and moonlight and tell a pre-dawn breeze from a bad omen. Alliances like that scarcely survive paperwork. They survive common danger, water shared when no one has enough, and even split of risk when the brush begins to whisper. The cost of such an alliance, though, is never paid just once. The border between Texas and Mexico, porous as a sieve and hard as a blade, ate good men for saying yes to the wrong flag on the wrong morning. In 1842, Flacco moved in the slipstream of Texan riders near the Rio Grande and met a soldier's death. Shot down not by the enemies he'd tracked for years, but by men in another uniform. The kind of wrong-turn violence that makes the borderlands feel like a fever dream, even to those who live there. Texans mourned him in the language they had. A monument, a handful of words carved with grief and gratitude. Ranger memories that would speak his name in camp for a decade after the stone cooled. Hayes kept the loss in that ledger he never showed. The column marked debt grew deeper by a man's height. This is the part of the Ranger story that resists being turned to clean brass. When people speak of Los Diablos Tejanos, they can mean admiration or accusation by the way they breathe the syllables. In Mexican streets, the name stung because the riders who wore it did not fight like parades. They arrived in alleys and left in rumors. In Texas settlements, the same name thrilled because it suggested speed and rescue, the promise that a dust cloud might be friends for once. Later generations would inherit both tones at once and argue about which belonged to the truer past. On the frontier itself, where truth came dressed in hoof marks and smoke, people were less fastidious. They kept two facts in the same hand. Rangers saved lives. Rangers took lives. The line between those sentences wavered in heat like a mirage. Technology made the line wobble even more. The Patterson revolver and later the Walker Colt changed the arithmetic of a close fight, and arithmetic is indifferent to ethics. A tool that helps a small group survive can, in a different hand or different mood, encourage a chase to run too long, a punishment to reach too far. Hayes understood the temptation. Speed intoxicates even the sober when a hot trail runs straight. His discipline, stay tight, never overrun your horses, strike and slip away, was not just style, it was a leash. Not every man who followed him could keep it wrapped around his wrist when the country opened like a racetrack and the blood still pounded in the jaw. The borderlands learned an old lesson wearing new clothes. When the tools get faster, men must love restraint more than they love victory, or the victors will grow monstrous without noticing it happen. Consider the way the new rhythm sounded to those on the far side of it. Comanche and Kiowa war parties had long counted on the pause after a single shot, the carpentered beat in which they could collapse the distance and finish a fight with lance or bow. The 5-shot pistol shoved a wedge into that pause. Suddenly, the run-in cost more than it paid. It did not end raiding. Storms still formed over the plains, but it made each storm think twice before rolling down into scrub, where ranger companies waited with a strange, stubborn thunder that did not die between claps. To the people who had long dominated those wide spaces, the new sound was an insult to muscle and skill, a reminder that courage is not the only currency on the field. To the settlers whose houses had been splinters on more than one morning, it was the sound of a reprieve. 2 truths, again, with no referee but time. And time was not charitable to Hayes' young lions. Robert A. Gillespie, the steady shot who stepped down at Walker's Creek when Hayes ordered the chief felled, took a bullet in the city fight at Monterey and died with the smell of adobe dust in his lungs. Samuel Hamilton Walker, who helped turn the Rangers' field lesson into iron, saw his name engraved on a cylinder and then fell in the streets of Huamantla the next year, leaving the weapon to outlive the hand that demanded it. You can trace their names in county seats and museum labels, but the only accounting that matters is this. The frontier made its point with men precisely as brave as it required, and then replaced them without ceremony. What, then, does the Devil's River have to say about memory? It is the clearest witness in this whole story, and it does not speak. The bends still shine as if the sky had fallen flat and learned to flow. The drop-offs still crouch underwater like quiet threats. The canyon still magnifies any sound you make, so that even a whispered plan seems presumptuous. You can carry a modern permit and a modern respect into that corridor and still feel the old judgments fall on your shoulders. Do you know what you're doing? Will you count before you move? Do you understand the price of being wrong here? Those are not history's questions. They are the rivers, and they make historians of everyone who steps to the edge and looks down. The Rangers' legend has grown handsome with time, as legends do, even while historians sand its edges and correct its boasts. The better stories admit the contradictions. Hayes commanded men who could be righteous or reckless by the hour, and the record gives you examples of both. He listened to scouts who were honored by some and used by others, and whose descendants remember both treatments vividly. He named a river in a tone that says more about the land than the man. Abrupt, unsentimental, exact. He carried a technology that made his small numbers fight like larger ones, and he spent a lifetime reminding those numbers to be small anyway, because small forces go home more often than big ones. And if the Devil's River is a moral at all, it is not a sermon, it is a method. Let water teach you how to move. Be generous with caution. Put speed only where the ground will hold it. Share credit with the quiet ones, the Lipan who tapped the next spring with a finger against the air, the Delaware who stood on a rim and measured 1,000 yards in thought before he said a word. Mark your crossings so the next party can live, and refuse to sell the notion that survival is the same as glory. These are not romantic instructions, but they built the only romance worth keeping, a road you can travel again. Hayes left Texas with those instructions stitched into him like a second skin. California gave him a different canvas, booming towns and courtroom quarrels, a sheriff's badge, and then a surveyor's seal. But the old habits kept their shape. Read the ground, Move as if time were a fuse. Don't confuse applause with proof. He died in Oakland, far from the limestone bellies of the Texas canyons, and lies under trees that drink a different light. Yet when the state he first served wanted to remember him, it looked not to speeches, but to the hard places he had made passable. Counties, plaques, pages. These are conveniences for the living. The river remains the real memorial. Stand again at the high lip and look down. The air feels colder by the water, even in August. The shadow fits like a borrowed coat. Somewhere in that hush are the hoofbeats of men who argued with death in short syllables and sometimes won. Somewhere, too, is the quiet tread of allies whose names seldom headline a chapter, but without whom the chapter would be blank. Listen long enough, and you will hear the argument the country still has with itself. About rangers and raiders, about the right to name a place and the right to live in it, about tools that make us strong and tempt us to be unkind. No narrator can finish that debate. The river keeps it in motion the way it keeps everything else. So we leave Hayes where he belongs, in the company of a clear stream that forgives nothing and forgets nothing, and under a sky that seems to weigh a man in his choices with equal gravity. He was not the biggest figure on the frontier, nor the loudest. He was, at crucial moments, the right kind of fast. If that feels like too simple a praise, ask the men who made it home because of it. Ask the land he learned to take seriously. Ask the Devil's River, which, when treated without respect, offers no second questions, and, when treated well, gives you a line of water through a country otherwise made of stone and stories. In the end, that is what endures. A way through.